Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace be upon you all, and welcome to another after show in Seeing God in Biology series. And Fuz, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm actually traveling
Oh,
today, so I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm doing some speaking. I spoke actually last night at Washington University in St. Louis, and got another speaking engagement tonight, and then uh, Friday evening as well. So I'm not at my home base, but I still think these after shows are so much fun to do that I'm happy to do them even when I'm on the road.
so thank you for taking all the trouble to do this today, regardless of your travel. And let's hope it's rewarding for our audience too. Inshallah, and we answer some of the questions. So number one, I think it was very mind-blowing to go through the even bit parity code when we were discussing this in the primary session, and it struck me to ask you this. This kind of design is like the designer of life, which is essentially, from our point of view, of course, is God. Um, if somebody does not believe that it's God, how can he explain that there is all this knowledge that is coming in from so many different disciplines? So obviously chemistry and biochemistry are there, but also information theory, electronics or electrical engineering, as we were discussing in DNA wires, and all the rest of it. As we will go, there are engineering concepts. On top of them, more engineering concepts. Something like the flagellum, for example, has so much of mechanical engineering and design of rotors and stators and you name it. So it's everything: mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, communication engineering, information theory, plus the chemistry and the biochemistry. So how would all of this add up, or what would it add up to if somebody does not believe that this is God? What could be a possible alternative, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason why I believe that there's a creator behind everything. Is I just don't see how an evolutionary explanation is sustainable, as because it's not just one aspect of the cell's chemistry that we're talking about. We're talking about the entirety of the cell's chemistry, revealing design in a variety of different ways. It's not just a single design argument, but it's an ensemble of design arguments that, in and of themselves, each one makes a case for the creator independently, but then collaboratively, everything it seems to point in the direction of design. And even when you see things that aren't necessarily optimal, or they on the surface appear to be bad designs, the more that we dig into those systems, the more that we realize that what we thought to be suboptimal designs or poor designs turn out to have a rationale for them. So consistently, the evidence just seems to mount. The trend line is towards design. It's not away from design by any means.
Absolutely. So I would like to kickstart this by sharing this extract from an interview with a well-known popularizer for the evolutionary or the Darwinian evolutionary paradigm, which is Richard Dawkins. So let's see what he has to say about the design in the cell, and an alternative explanation from his point of view, and then we see what the audience would think about that, and we take it forward.
In the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So that
Okay, so that was interesting. So Professor Dawkins is okay that there is obvious design in the cell and there is a signature. In his own words, there is an obvious signature in the cell, but he would rather say that it's aliens, and then he would say that aliens have come about by evolutionary mechanisms themselves, but it's completely eliminating the possibility of them being like created. Question: If the evidence points to something being created, is there something in science, in biochemistry, for example, that prevents a creator to intervene? I mean, is there a certain rule that no creators allowed or something?
Well, I mean, in a sense, what you're seeing Dawkins express is an idea known as methodological naturalism, which today in science really is the undergirding philosophical framework. And what that idea means in a nutshell is that you must pursue mechanistic, natural process explanations for the origin and the design in the history of life, or really any phenomena within the universe. Now, and so Dawkins is arguing that if indeed one day we actually do have very clear evidence that life was designed, well, the only way you maintain the methodological naturalism is to say that designer must be some kind of physical entity that itself was produced through some kind of mechanistic process. So as long as you're not appealing to that designer being outside the universe, then I guess, it's considered to be a legitimate scientific idea. And in fact, it was Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel who proposed this idea of directed panspermia, where they said, well, maybe an alien civilization deliberately seeded the earth with life, and that was life of their own design. And so that was considered to be a legitimate possible explanation for the origin of life, was through this process of directed panspermia. There are scientists who've proposed things called the zoo hypothesis, that maybe life on Earth is like a zoo that some kind of alien civilization put in place and is now studying or is observing for their own pleasure. But and so, these are ideas that really are borderline ridiculous at one level. So if you're going to posit that, why not at least be open to the possibility that maybe that designer is outside the universe itself, that designer brought the universe into existence. And of course that makes sense when you think about things like the fact that the universe has a beginning, that we see design in the in the fundamental constants of physics. These are all pointing to a personal designer, a personal creator outside of the universe itself. And so when we see design in biochemistry, why not why not follow it to its logical conclusion? At least entertain that possibility.
Yeah, so it's more like a philosophical position rather than really a scientific position. It's I think it would be more honest to whether scientists or science explainers that when they take these positions, that they should be clear that this is their philosophical standpoint, rather than as if it is it's against science to take a conclusion for God. So here we have a comment. Sharif Sakhr says, how come a random chemical recombination results in a functional specificity of information organization in DNA? So what's your comment to that? Is it possible that random processes like noise would generate organized information? I think prior to that, he was also asking about Shannon information and information theory and how does it relate to DNA. So I think the two questions are actually connected. So what's your comment? Is it in the lab? Can you just get one of those machines that would stitch together some nucleotides and put a random function to pick random nucleotides, and voila, you have a functioning outcome out of that? Just keep throwing them, and then you have something that's actually functional and it builds parts that interact together. Is this something that we can see?
Yeah, well, it's hard to envision how just randomly combining, nucleotides, or randomly combining amino acids is somehow going to generate, some kind of functionality. And what you have to keep in mind is that, and this is really, I think, part of Michael Behe's point. But when we think about this in the context of the origin of life, let's say by chance a protein emerges that is able to catalyze, the polymerization of two nucleotides, just as an example. Well, if that protein emerges by chance, if you don't have a fully blown biochemical apparatus, that property is absolutely useless in isolation, right? There's nothing that is going to preserve, that system from the standpoint of natural selection. Now, maybe it might be a chemically persistent system, but that's very different than natural selection, and so it might persist because it's a robust, system. But again, it can persist for as long as you would like. In isolation, it doesn't do anything. So it's not just simply, can you generate information by randomly combining, amino acids or nucleotides, but you also have to, at the same time, have a decoding mechanism, a genetic code, and some kind of decoding hardware. You've got to have a collection of proteins that are going to work collaboratively to support living processes in order for replication to happen. There have been studies that have been done trying to identify what is the minimum complexity for life, what is the bare essential requirements for living systems. And it turns out that you're looking at minimally probably 500 different types of proteins that would be needed.
Wow.
For a minimal life form. This would not
500.
This would not be a life form that could exist independently in the environment, but this would be a life form that could exist in a laboratory setting where you have, biochemists feeding the cell all the things it needs. If you're looking at something that can exist independently in the environment, you're looking at minimally 1,500 distinct types of proteins, not just 500.
Wow.
But the core systems are, it would be DNA replication, it would be protein synthesis, which would include, transcription in the genetic code and the activity translation at the ribosomes. It would involve the ability to form and maintain stable cell membranes, and then also some ability to extract energy from the environment and convert it into a useful form for the cell. These are the core systems you have to have for an entity to exist as a living entity. So in the light of the question that was just asked, to me, whether or not randomly combining, amino acids or nucleotides can produce information isn't really the question. It's how does everything else that's needed come together simultaneously. There's this integrated complexity that is beyond imagination, even for the simplest cells.
Absolutely. I was actually having a debate with one evolutionist or Darwinist. And then he says, okay, what do you mean by that? Let's assume that any set of nucleotides come together. Essentially, those nucleotides will translate into a protein anyway. So then comes your question, so how will they translate? So they will need all the machinery, which needs proteins itself. So there is a chicken and egg problem there. But even if we have borrowed those machinery to start with from I don't know, from the future, then this protein that is produced that is doing nothing will not find any system to plug into. And as you say, you will need like 500 of those to come together, and they need to work together, or 1,500 of them, and they are really built for each other. So I think this is a complete dead end to presume or to assume or to put a proposition that there is any other possibility other than that life has just come in a complete integrated form. And I think then the only possible explanation is that a creator has put it together.
Yes.
So yeah, and this is maybe why Dawkins in this video says maybe aliens did it, but then it's just like pushing the can only, or kicking the can, because at the end of the day, who created aliens? Because at the end of the day, the universe has a finite life, so aliens will need somebody to create them. So if they are so smart that they have created us, then they would have gone through an evolutionary process that is more than our 4.5 billion years, right?
Yes.
And we don't have so many 4.5 billion years in the universe, by the way.
We don't. And, it's just interesting that, again, people are okay thinking about extraterrestrial creators, but when it comes to extra universal creator, people become very uncomfortable. And I think part of the reason is that if indeed there is a creator that brought everything into existence, now you're forced to ask the question, what is my relationship to that creator? And that can lead to some very uncomfortable terrain, if you're not willing to
have this relation.
If you're not willing to recognize that as creatures we are in obligation to our creator. And so I want to be careful about saying that that's the motivation for everyone to reject God's existence, but it does become a very important factor. Absolutely. When I was an agnostic and I just became convinced there was a creator, those are the questions I asked. Who's that creator? How do I relate to that creator? I would hope other people would think along those terms. But if it's an extraterrestrial creator, then you don't have to ask those questions.
Or an extraterrestrial who's just watching a zoo. Even worse. Even worse.
Yeah.
So we have another comment here. It's from from our friend Man's Man. He says, wasn't it Einstein who said scientists make poor philosophers? And I think he's referring to my comment that some of those actually positions are philosophical positions rather than, I'm not sure if it was Einstein. Do you know about what's that answer?
I don't know if he said that, but you know, and I'm going to be a little bit self-critical of scientists, being a scientist myself. But you know, when I look at my education in the sciences, there was very little time for any kind of studies beyond science itself. You know, there might be a few courses you take as an undergraduate, at least in the United States, that just give you some exposure to other areas, the humanities and things like that. But you were supposed to be focusing on science and math courses. And in graduate school, if I would have gone to my advisor and I said, I think I really need a good course in the philosophy of science or a good course in the history of science, he would have kicked me out of his office back into the lab. You know, get to work, buddy. What are you doing, right? And so my point is that scientists are highly trained, you know, but they are poorly educated because there's not an appreciation that there is a philosophical aspect of the scientific enterprise, or that there's a history of science where is a significant part of that history was shaped by theists who were studying the world around them because of theological and religious motivations, and the way they viewed the world, you know, were in those terms. And so it's unfortunate that I think many scientists don't really appreciate the philosophical aspects of what they're doing. And so as a result, there's some really naive things that are said, you know. And I can remember, gosh, years ago, before I was working at Reasons to Believe, which is the organization I'm part of, I was working for a Fortune 500 company in research and development. And we were, you know, sitting around the lunch table one day, and I said, I'm just curious, why is it that as scientists that we can't propose as a scientific model the work of an intelligent agent? Why is it that we only have to appeal to mechanism? And nobody at the table could give me an answer to that question, right? You know, because as a scientist, you just learn, this is when you propose a model, these are the criteria for proposing the model that you can't, nobody thinks deeply about, well, why is that? And to me, what really defines science is the methodology itself. And there's nothing inherent in the methodology that excludes the possibility that a creator may be responsible for certain features of the universe. And in fact, the question becomes, how would we test that? And I think there very well could be ways to test those ideas. You know, it's just that we're not really willing to do that as scientists because of the constraints of methodological naturalism. And we somehow think that this defines science when in fact it's really the methodology of science.
Yes, and actually your points are very insightful in terms of it hasn't been this way. So whether when it was, the Greeks, I think they started from a point of philosophy, and then philosophy went on to, science and mathematics and astronomy, etc., based on whatever, whether be it the ideas of Plato or whoever. But there is always in the backdrop a god or the god, and then when it was when Muslims, started working, it was also the same motivation, and let's go and explore how God created the universe, and he's giving us commands to research and to find him. And then when Christians were doing the same thing, I think many of the scientific discoveries was actually from people who were priests, maybe that gave them the time to contemplate and work, and they don't have to run after their livelihoods. And then until very soon, even the greatest Western scientists like Newton, etc., were people of faith, obviously. And So it's really miserable that in this age, where scientists should have more freedom, they actually have less.
Yeah.
So it's really amazing that this is the status quo. Here we have another comment. It says the idea of a protein randomly coming into existence is like expecting a sorting algorithm like Bogo sort to sort elements perfectly. I suggest watching sorting algorithm videos on YouTube. All right. And on my question of the chicken and egg, it isn't a question of chicken or egg. It's clearly chicken and egg.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to explain both because both come together, and you need to know how.
That's right.
Yeah, we also have another question here from Sharif. He says, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origins of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. And this is a quotation from Francis Crick. I didn't know that one. So, and what would a miracle mean in this context, in your opinion?
Well, I think what, Crick is doing there is rhetorical, right? It's just a flair for a flair for rhetoric more so than anything. But in that sense, and I've heard people like Leslie Orgel when he was alive, who is a collaborator with Crick, and then also a leading origin of life researcher in his day. Say it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA could ever come into existence, or, for metabolism first. It's an appeal to, a near miracle. And, what is being meant in that context, because both Orgel and Crick were atheists and outspoken atheists, was the idea that, there really is no explanation, that miracle becomes a placeholder for essentially having no clue or no understanding of how it would have happened, and so you might as well be appealing to a miraculous act, but so that's what I think they're getting at there with those comments is, miracle becomes a placeholder for having really no understanding and really probably no prospects of understanding what happened. But again, if the origin of life appears to be miraculous, should you not at least consider that as a possible explanation?
Yeah, if all the evidence are taking you there, and even what we've learned in the session that we had today is that it's not only about having RNA or DNA strand just come by sheer coincidence or by a miracle, but that it will also have to resolve to use a very limited set of all the nucleobases that are out there, because otherwise the system will consider them errors. The way they will attach together, they need to be those four specifically, otherwise it will be unstable, or it will cause bulges, or it will get stuck somewhere in the replication process, etc. So I think even the more we learn, the more we see that this system is optimized to the extent that even getting a random, just completely random piece of RNA or DNA strand that can actually do something that might be even completely worthless, but just doing something seems to be very difficult, given all the constraints that biochemistry and information theory and communications engineering, etc., and electrical engineering keep uncovering all the time, to the extent that you need DNA to have a specific structure, and you need it to have conductivity, and you need it to have those four specific nucleobases, and then you need one of them to be different in RNA, and then you need all the other. So it's one constraint after one constraint after one constraint. It seems that even having that one strand, even with a random set of nonsense nucleotides, is very difficult to have anyway.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me how what we talked about last week with DNA wires actually intersects with what we talked about today the even parity bit structure in DNA, because again, if you don't have, the code words having even parity, or if they're not even parity code words, then you don't get that electrostatic repulsion and steric repulsion that forces the distortion in the double helix. Well, if that doesn't happen, then you don't have the mechanism in place to disrupt the wire properties of DNA so that the surveillance systems can actually detect the damage. So, it's like the coincidences are stacking up. But when we start thinking about these as integrated systems, the comment that you played last week was, evolution just uses whatever is laying around, whatever is available to it. Well, how lucky can evolution get that all these just right, molecules with the just right properties happen to be available, right?
Absolutely. To the extent that just picking those four will mean that the wire will remain connected unless something that will bring apart the nucleotides, and then the wire properties will come into, and then error detection is possible, not only an effect of an error, but the detection of error, the fast detection of an error, and then error correction becomes possible, etc. So it seems that even missing just a small piece of the whole thing will immediately cause error accumulation, immediate degradation. There will not be time for the rest of the system to come together, if at all it is possible for a system to come together. So it's completely mind-boggling that some people are thinking of this possibility. But I think it brings us to this one question, Faz. I don't think I've asked you before. So what's the story that brought you as a biochemist to what was it to believe that there is, what made you ask this question around the table in the Fortune 500 company where you were working? What specific experiment or what specific note or eureka moment was it?
Well, I was an agnostic when I went to graduate school, and I was strongly influenced by the teaching of my professors as an undergraduate, steeped in the evolutionary paradigm. But in graduate school, and I took the message to heart, it was, you need to learn to think independently. That's what we were being challenged to do. And you need to be courageous enough to say, this is what the data is saying, regardless of what anybody else around you is saying. And so I took that to heart. And the more that I really immersed myself in the details of biochemical systems as a graduate student, and I got a chance to interact with fellow students and other faculty members and see what they're doing, we all would walk around and say, this is absolutely amazing. This is mind-blowing. And so everybody saw the ingenuity and the remarkable nature of these systems. And I can remember beginning to think, well, how do we explain where these systems come from? This is the origin of life question. And so on my own, it wasn't part of my coursework or my research requirements. I just started to read the literature in origin of life research. And it was like, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. This has to, this all has to come together at once, for it to, for life to even be possible. And the only way it comes together all at once, where everything is working in a just right way, is if there's a creator behind everything. And so it was really the insufficiency of chemical evolution and just the elegant designs that we see. And so really I've spent, since that time, I've spent years revisiting those conclusions. Were those conclusions valid? And have written a number of books where I continue to press against those conclusions. So I'm not just sitting back and saying, I'm a believer now and I'm all done with it. But it's like, was my reasons justified? And in fact, the evidence today suggests that they were more than justified. In fact, they're much stronger today. But that lunch conversation was really triggered by the growing recognition that I had, the aha moment that I had, that a lot of the approach that we all take as scientists is shaped by a philosophical framework, methodological naturalism, not necessarily by what the evidence is saying. And so I was just curious to see, if other scientists even had an awareness of how much philosophy was really influencing what they were doing, and influencing them in an unwitting way.
And in your experience during your journey, did you find others who landed ashore with you, or where is the balance? Is biochemistry, or people who study these magnificent systems, more likely to believe, and if not, what stops them? Is it the fear of the commitment? What's your experience about that? Because
well, my personal experience matches what I've seen from survey data. Gosh, it's been a few years ago, but the Pew Research Foundation did a survey looking for the rate of belief among scientists by discipline. And I can't remember. Yeah, and so it turns out that at that time, with that survey, the group of scientists that had the highest level of belief, and it was close to, I'm thinking it was close to 25 to 30% were chemists. 25 to 30% of chemists had personal belief in God, and then very closely behind that were physicists. Right, interestingly enough. And then it was biochemists would have been the next category. And as you got to softer sciences, into biology and the softer sciences, the rate of belief, began to tail off. But still, on average, you would have very close to 25, 30% of scientists expressing belief in God, and then another 15% or so would express belief in a higher power. They may not say it was a personal God, but they saw, they were people of some type of spiritual orientation, if not, a religious commitment. So, so that's been my experience personally. Is I know a lot of people who are chemists who believe in God. I know a lot of biochemists who believe in God. Some of them are more outspoken than others, about their belief. But so I've seen the numbers highest there. I do see a number of believers in biology too, but they tend to be more theistic evolutionists if they're within biology, and I think in part that is what they need to do to maintain credibility in their discipline, and I think many of them are also convinced that God used the mechanism of evolution to create. But the people that are willing to challenge the evolutionary paradigm tend to be chemists, physicists, and then to a lesser degree biochemists.
Yeah. So in your opinion, so if we're looking at 25 to 30% plus 15%, so we are like at 45%. How do the 55%, and obviously we're talking about the West or maybe the US, right?
Yes.
How do the rest of them get around it?
Well, it's interesting because my colleague Hugh Ross and I have attended Origin of Life conferences, and we're usually pretty open about who we are. We don't hide our identity or anything like that, and we seek out and engage, the conference attendees, who are committed to evolutionary explanations to the origin of life, and when they understand that we actually have a really good grasp of the science, they are willing to talk with us. So it seems like that's the ticket. I'm not going to talk with you, but unless you demonstrate to me that you actually understand the science.
Okay.
That's kind of like the gateway. But once you pass through that gateway, it's remarkable to me how little many of these scientists have actually ever thought about theological questions. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who would identify as atheists, who work in chemical evolution or some aspect of the origin of life problem, who would say, I've just never thought about it. I'm a scientist. I don't think about philosophical or theological issues. I just think about scientific issues. I guess I would be an atheist. I mean, that's their level of commitment. And so when we would begin to share with them the idea that science and religion can go together, and here's some ways to think about it, they're intrigued. They're intrigued by the idea. So I think of that 55%, there's a significant proportion who have just never thought about these issues, which is why I think this kind of programming and these kind of discussions are really very important, because it forces, I think, people to engage with, some of the more theological aspects of what science might be pointing to, or which we think is very clearly pointing to.
Wow. It's just shocking that such smart people would sleep at night seeing all this elegance and striking design and just not think of it.
It's interesting because I can never remember the name of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I should write it down, but I find it fascinating, and it's written by a woman who is a molecular biologist, maybe from Sweden. Her name's Ursula Goodenough, and she was she calls herself a religious nonbeliever, right?
Religious nonbeliever. Okay.
Yes, and so her point is that when she considers the creation, she stands in awe and has a spiritual experience that overwhelms her. Yet she denies God's existence, and so she has this spiritual response to the creation, but it considers herself in a sense irreligious. And so her book, it's a relatively small book, and it goes through different aspects of the creation, and then afterwards she has like almost a devotional response where she'll she includes maybe a passage from the Psalms or from the Quran, or some piece of poetry where it's her attempt to have a spiritual response. And what's interesting is, forgive me, but what's interesting is that this is so reminiscent of what I see the Apostle Paul write to the church at Rome in his epistle to the Romans, where he begins that by saying, the evidence for God is clearly seen, so people are without an excuse, but the tendency of human beings is to worship the creation, not the creator. And that's what I see many scientists do, is they actually are having a spiritual or a response to the creation, but their worship is misdirected to the creation itself. So I see many scientists that I've known over the years who, like you and I, would be in amazement at what we talked about today, the parity bit code structure, and they would marvel at it, and they would ask these interesting questions about it, but they in effect are religious non-believers in the sense that they have a spiritual response or a worshipful response, but they misdirect it. Right. So that's just been my experience, is, we shouldn't walk away thinking that scientists don't appreciate the elegant design of the world around them, or that they don't respond in a way that's similar to our response. It's just that they, refuse to acknowledge the creator.
I think it's like Donald McDonald paper where he says this is completely amazing,
Mhm.
and then and then he just says maybe evolution just hit it by coincidence or something.
Yeah.
Come on, you just did this incredible analysis showing that those four nucleobases specifically are amazingly chemically fit in terms of stability, in terms of the information theory, everything. They just satisfy all the conditions that you need for the four characters that will build all the alphabet, and then you consider it a coincidence. It's totally unbelievable.
Yeah.
So let's. I think the comment that I have tried the comment that you have just said. I remember I posted one video on the channel, like it was like 1.5 years ago or something, and then some scientists, I think he was in Canada, and he had a Muslim name too, and he was just going, like going ballistic in the comment section, and it was the video was more towards the origin of life thing, and then I started responding to him, and I just keep responding, and I just wrote this big one, and then at the end of it, he said, "Pardon me, I didn't know that you understand science, and I agree with you that yes, we have a problem with those reactions being kinetic, and we have a problem with that kind of stability and that kind of this and that, etc." And then it's almost like, yeah, we don't know how this works. And I was so surprised that he was so much attacking in the beginning and then so much acknowledging at the end. So the question to you is why? If if science is fact-based, why would your position as a scientist in a scientific discussion be affected by the scientific literacy of your interlocutor? It doesn't make sense. If somebody is coming to you as a life scientist or an origin of life researcher and telling you your discipline just doesn't make sense, and what you claim to be origin of life research is still origin of life questions, you didn't find anything yet, really, other than uncovering more and more mysteries and more complexities that need even more complex answers. Why would they just not go straight? Yes, guys, you are right. We are so far away from knowing anything. The origin of life remains a miracle. Just plain simple English, and doesn't depend on who you're talking with. Why do they take this strange? Because it seems to be a common experience that we're having here.
Yeah, I've had that experience too, and I don't know, I don't know why the educational level or the knowledge level of the person raising the questions matters, right? I don't know why that is. Yeah.
I have an explanation, but I'll take
I'm
your
curious.
opinion.
I'm curious what it is, because
I
I've observed the same thing, but I even as a scientist, I don't really know why that would be.
This is a speculation, but since you are in the field of biochemistry, I'm on the application side, on the engineering side. The engineering is more, you start with the science and then you apply it, but engineering closes the loop because you understand that what the science says and what reality means is that things do not happen by chance. If
Right.
there is a creation, there is a creator. That's why I think the percentage will never be 30% or 45% in engineering and medicine. You'll find it very close to the other side of the formula, the 80s or something. But I think the reason is this. It's because the 55% who are ignoring the question, I think it's like a choice to keep ignoring it. And if they find that they're talking to somebody at a level of ignorance compared to them, then they would rather not, they would rather just dismiss the discussion rather than go into a discussion that will force them to open a question they would rather not address. And then when they find that you actually know too much, then it becomes embarrassing to them as scientists not now to engage in a scientific discussion, where they will have a credibility issue if they do not acknowledge what you're saying.
Mm.
But then they will have to come to the ground and tell you, well, we never thought about it.
Yeah.
And then when you add 1 + 1 = 2, it's not just like they never thought about it. They don't want to think about it, and pushing something in front of them, the easy exit would be, well, you don't know what you're talking about. We call it a day, and they close it. They close the discussion. Do you think that this can be actually what's going on? And
yeah, I think it could very well be. That's pretty insightful, because at the end of the day, it really becomes, it's really a question of psychology more in sociology more so than anything. Yeah. I think you're onto something, and you're right. I mean, when you're involved in science, and I'm sure this is true with engineering, the problems you're working on can become all-consuming. They're fun, they're fascinating. You can become obsessive about them, and you don't really want to spend time doing other things or thinking about other things. This becomes, again, your all-consuming passion. And so it's very easy then to use that as an excuse, to really sidestep thinking about, the really important issues in life. It probably is similar to the issue of wealth and prosperity. Is people that are wealthy and prosperous, can surround themselves with so many distractions that they don't have to think about the big questions, the important questions, until they're forced to by illness or some kind of tragedy in their life. And I think, science can function in that way. It's such a distraction, and in some respects, it's a noble distraction. I'm trying to solve problems. I'm trying to gain understanding that's going to benefit humanity, right? I'm trying to produce, some kind of engineering advance that's going to, to help change the world, make the world a better place. That becomes a noble distraction, but at the end of the day, it does prevent you from asking those questions. And so you're right, when you're forced then into a situation where you have to confront those questions, it becomes uncomfortable. And if there's an out, you're going to take it.
Yeah, I guess I'll have to rename this after show, because we really went into topics that are really very important. Maybe we should find a title like why scientists do not marvel on what they discover, or something. How come scientists are not seeing God in biology, or are they really not seeing, or are they looking the other side, or something? So we need to find a fun title and rename it. But I think it puts a great responsibility and great advantage and great potential for good deeds, actually, in people like you, Fuz, and people like Dr. James Tour, and people like Hugh Ross, etc., and people in this field who can actually relate to those scientists. Because I think in the age of science, people who know science will be the best people to call people to God, or to acknowledge a creator, at least. So I would close by this comment from Manzwan. He says, earlier, Brother Ahmed mentioned atheists simply pushing back the problem of who created the creator by invoking aliens. How do we counter their attempts to levy the same accusation against God? I think then he is asking about their question, who created God? And yeah, I think if you're living in a simulation, or if we were software creatures, for example, then every other creature has to be software. But really, the programmer who has developed the whole matrix is not made of software. He is a material being. So I think us being inside this material universe, looking into a regress of lesser creators, material creators of objects, we cannot project the vision of our world to the one who has actually created this world. And an infinite regress is a philosophical impossibility. So I think, again, the answer to this question is in philosophy, because if every creator needs a previous creator, then nothing will be created at all. And I think this is actually rightfully what you mentioned, Faz, is that those questions would essentially originate from people who are not good at either of philosophy or theology, or actually both. Would you agree to that?
I would. And, what's interesting to me is, my friend Hugh Ross makes a point that's very similar to the one you make, is that we as human beings live in a universe where there's a single dimension of time that moves only in a single direction. And in that kind of universe, everything that exists at one point in time had to have a beginning. But for a creator who's outside of our universe, that requirement simply doesn't exist. And so, that creator is not like us. And so it's legitimate, I think, to say that the creator is categorically distinct from us. And so it's a category error to say, well, who created the creator? Because people that are, that hold to, monotheism are arguing that creator is an uncaused being, that has eternally existed, that is self-sufficient, and so that kind of being doesn't need to have a creator by definition. By definition. But
Absolutely.
What I think is interesting is that nobody can escape the idea that ultimately there has to be an uncaused cause. Either it's a personal God, or it is some kind of impersonal force or force field or something that is eternally existing. And so even if you hold to an atheistic or materialistic perspective, you don't get away from the question who ultimately created the or caused, or what caused the uncaused force field, or the uncaused quantum foam. You still have to appeal to an uncaused cause. The issue is it personal or is it impersonal? And it's much more convenient if it's impersonal than if the uncaused cause is a personal being.
Yeah, so I think this is a great ending. So thank you very much once again for this insightful discussion. More today into philosophy and theology and how people think, and why scientists do not necessarily see what we see. And it seems that the conclusion is they don't see it because either they don't explore it, or they look the other side, or they would rather not go into the commitment. So I hope that as much of them and as much as undergraduate and graduate students will watch this. And I would ask those who watch this to share it with people who are especially in their age of trying to find purpose, which is typically in the younger age. And of course, we have a very interesting episode coming up next time, which is about DNA data storage, where we will look more into the marvels of this unbelievable creation of God. And I'll just close by our friend Mansman, who says, "Streams with Dr. Fuz have been my favorite." So
Very kind.
And then Sharif says, "Mine too." And I'm sure many who will watch this will say the same. So thank you very much, Fuz, and have a great trip and a safe return, inshallah.
Yes. Take care.
All right. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody, and peace be upon you all.